After the parshas, after the sections in our parsha regarding the dinim of that of a zov, that of a person who had an emission of shechva zera, that of a nida and a zova, the Torah concludes at the end of the sedra, zois Torahs hazov, these are the laws of the zov, vasher teitze mimenu shechva zera goimer. Then it speaks about vahadova benidasa, a woman that was a nida, vahazov ezoivoi, one who was a zav, la zochar v'lanakeva, a male or a female, etc. Rashi explains, zois Torahs hazov, these are the laws of the zav. Rashi says that this refers to Baal Re'iyah Achas, someone that saw one discharge. Umau Toirase, and what is the law? So Rashi is basing this on the next words of the pasuk, Vasher Teitze Mimenu Shechva Zera, that one who only had one irregular discharge is similar to a Baal Keri, meaning that he's only Tamei till that evening. Then when the pasuk goes on and says Vahazov Ez Zoivoi, this refers to someone who had seen twice a discharge, Ubal Shalosh Re'iyos, as well as someone who had seen 3 times, which the laws of these things was already explicitly mentioned earlier in the Torah. The Rebbe says, Mefarshim explain that what's forcing Rashi to say that the word Zois Torahs Hazov is not referring to the laws of the Zav that were discussed earlier in the Parsha, but rather this new concept of a Zav that saw only once, which its law is being stated right here in the Pasuk, as Rashi says, Umahu Toirosoi, what is the law of this type of Zav? Vasher Teitze Mimenu Shechva Zera is similar to someone that just saw an ordinary emission of Shechva Zera. It's from the fact that in the next Pasuk, the Pasuk is going to repeat and say, Vahazov Ez Zoivoi, La Zochar, from a male. In other words, so we speak already about the dinim of a Zav in the next pasuk, and therefore this must be referring to something else. Rashi says that these two psukim are referring to 2 different things. Zois Torahs Hazav and Hazav Ezoivoi are referring to 2 things. Zois Torahs Hazav in the first pasuk is speaking someone that saw one time, one discharge. And from the fact that the Torah is separating this from the other dinim of the Zav is because this person that only saw one time has a different din than a regular Zav. And as Rashi says, Umau Toirase, what is the Torah, what is the law of this person, this Zav that only saw once? That he's similar to a Baal Keri. Then there is what's being discussed in the next pasuk, Vahazav Ezoivoi. This is one who saw twice or saw 3 times, which the laws of these things were already discussed earlier in the Parsha. However, says the Rebbe, we need to understand this pirush, that the 2 categories in these 2 psukim are one who saw once, and in the other category is one who saw twice or 3 times, has a number of difficulties, b'derech hapshat. Because number one, why would the Torah tell us about this person that saw this category, this first category of a Zav that only saw 1 time, only tell it to us now at the very, very end of the Parsha, after all of the different categories that were discussed already earlier in the Parsha, and after the Pasuk says already, V'hizartem es b'nei Yisrael, you should separate the Yidden from all of their tumois, and suddenly we're being given this new din over here. Why wouldn't have it put it in earlier by the dinim of a Zav or the dinim of a Baal Keri? Especially that he too is seeing 1 time. And in fact, you cannot see twice unless you first had 1 time. So it should have been said earlier on when those things were being discussed. Point number 2, says the Rebbe. According to this, the word Zois Toiras in the beginning of these 2 psukim are going to have to be divided and understood in 2 different ways. In other words, as far as the first thing that it says, Zois Toiras Hazav, it means what we're about to say, the new law that we're about to teach, that a Zav that saw 1 time is similar to a Baal Keri. And as far as what it says in the next pasuk, V'hadava b'nidasa v'hazav ezoivoi, what does the word Zois Toiras mean when it's speaking about that? That these are the laws, that which was already taught to you earlier in the Parsha, as Rashi says. We're saying one new law now about a Zav that's seeing 1 time, and about the further things, Zois Toiras is like just saying these are the laws, that which we discussed already earlier in the Parsha. Point number 3, says the Rebbe. According to this siyum, these last few psukim, which seem to be summarizing the previous sections, is completely not in the order of how they actually said earlier in the parsha. Earlier in the parsha of Zav comes before the one who has a regular emission of Shechva Zera, and before Nida. Whereas here in this pasuk, we have V'hazav Zoivoy, which according to Rashi means the Zav that was discussed earlier in the parsha. Where does it say over here? After the din of a Nida, after V'hadava b'nidasa. So the Rebbe concludes and says, why would Rashi, who is Pshutei Shel Mikra, learn that these two categories are that's being discussed in these psukim are Baal Re'io Acha, someone that saw one discharge, and then the second category is one who saw it twice or three times? Seemingly Rashi should have learned that the word Zois Toiras is only simply a sachakal, a summary of everything we learned earlier. And therefore, Zois Toiras Hazav, Rashi could have seemingly learned, not the way Rashi learns that it means someone that just saw once. It could have simply meant Zois Toiras Hazav is the one who saw it twice, and Vahazav Ezoive is the one who saw it three times, which then it's fully summarizing what was said earlier in the parsha. As Rashi had already explained earlier, and in the beginning of the parsha of the Zav, that there is a difference between a Zav that saw twice and a Zav that saw three times, because a Zav that saw twice, he has the full dinim of the Tumah of a Zav, whereas once he sees a third time, he also has to bring a carbon. And why would the Torah put this detail of the Zav of the three Re'iyos not in its place before Vasher Teitzei Mimenu Shechva Zera, but why is it being put in the next pasuk together with the Zava? If we would learn that the one of two Re'iyos is in the first pasuk and the one of three Re'iyos is in the second pasuk, so we could say simply it's because that these two, the Zav that saw three times, along with the Zava, have both a special din, which makes them different to everybody else, because they are the ones that need to bring a carbon for the kapara, for this tumah of ziva, etc. The Rebbe says, l'cha'oira, we would have been able to answer that what's bothering Rashi is the double expression v'hazav as zoivoy. Not like in the first pasuk where it says zois toiras hazav, where the word zav only says once, but in the next pasuk it says v'hazav as zoivoy. And this causes Rashi to say that the pasuk is coming to hint in that second pasuk to two types of zav itself. You know, there's one that saw twice and one that saw three times. Similar to what Rashi had learned this difference already earlier on, the difference between one who saw twice and three times, from the double expression in the psukim earlier on in the parsha, as Rashi says that the pasuk enumerates, first of all, a zav that saw twice, because it says Zav mibsoroi zoivoi, so there's two expressions of Zav over there. And then the pasuk also speaks about someone that saw three times, a second category of a Zav, because there it says bezoivoi, and then it says again Ror b'soroi as zoivoi, or hechtem soroi mi zoivoi. So from the fact that the first time it says twice the word Zav, and then we have three times the word Zav. So earlier on in the Parsha, Rashi told us that this teaches us that there are two categories in the Zav, twice or three times. So l'cha'ira, we could say that's what's happening over here as well, because there's this double expression. So this is what's causing Rashi to say this. And since, says the Rebbe, in these two psukim, again, we have altogether three times the word Zav, because we have Zois Toiras HaZav, and then we have in the next pasuk V'hazav Ezoivoi. So this might be the reason why Rashi is learning that Zois Toiras Hazav is one who saw one time. V'hazav Ezoivoi is referring to one who saw twice or three times. But the Rebbe says it's difficult to say that that's really what's causing Rashi to say this, that the double expression of V'hazav Ezoivoi, that's what's causing, because the Rebbe says this is not such a strong diuk with derech hapshat, to say that because it says twice, therefore it automatically means a Zav that saw that many times. Because it's similar to, and especially it's coming right in directly connected to, and following the words v'hadava b'nidasa, which is also a double expression. And therefore, says the Rebbe, there's no room to say that because of this, Rashi should learn such a seemingly distant pshat, and to say that this is the pshat in Zois Toiras Hazav, Vasher Teitzei Mimenu Shechva Zera, that Zav refers to one time, and later when it says v'hazav ezoivoi, it refers to someone who saw twice or three times. In addition to this, says the Rebbe, even if we should say that the double expression v'hazov ezoivoi is a diuk in derech hapshat, we could say this that derech hapshat, that's a way to learn. However, this style of learning, that because it's a double expression, automatically it's going to be two different categories, is more an inyan of medrash. As Rashi had said earlier, Rashi himself had said earlier, when he spoke about this difference between two re'iyos or shalosh re'iyos, three re'iyos, which we learned from the fact that the pasuk said twice the words of, or three times the words of. So Rashi says it's not pshutoi, it's medrashoi. So in other words, even if there's room for Rashi to use it, but it's more the medrash style. And therefore Rashi should have emphasized over here also that this pirush is a medrash. Says the Rebbe, the explanation is, the word Zois Toiras Hazov is similar to what we had earlier in Chumash Vayikra. We had a few times similar expressions where it says Zois Toiras Ha'oila, or Zois Toiras Hamincha, and so on, which as Rashi explained to us in those places, that when it says Zois Toiras Ha'oila, it means that there's one law where it was speaking about the law of all the carbon oilos. Or Zois Toiras Hamincha would mean we're speaking now about the law that applies to all the carbon minchas. So Zois Toiras Hazov means that the Torah is coming over here and is going to tell us all the categories of Zav. That's what Zois Toiras Hazov means. And it's going to be going in order from the least severe to the most severe. And this is how we'll understand now why the Torah says V'hazov v'zoivoi la zochor. Not where it speaks earlier about the Zav, earlier in the Parsha, but rather over here it's putting it together with Vila Nekeva, Zav together with Zava, because a Zav and a Zav are going to have the same sort of stringency. The problem, however, then is, we look at these psukim, and it says, Zois Toiras Hazov, Va'asher Teitze Mimenu Shichva Zora. Since it says Va'asher, so the Zav and one who Shichva Zera comes from him, that tells us that the Zav is already also one of the categories of what we're discussing over here, of these people that are going to be Tameh. In other words, it's not just Zois Toiras HaZav, comma, and then we start off with categories, Asher Teitzim and Shichva Zera. It sounds like the Zav itself is one of the categories. If we just said that the Torah is going to be going in order, minakal, from the least severe to the most severe, that would then sound like, it seems to be telling us that there's a certain Zav who, in his din, in his halacha, is going to be more lenient than the one who had a regular mission of Shichva Zera, Asher Teitzim and Shichva Zera. Since, says the Rebbe, we cannot say that a Zav that saw twice would be similar to, and certainly not more lenient than the one that had a regular sighting of Shichva Zera, this is what forces Rashi to say that when it says Zois Toiras Hazav, we mean someone that only saw once. And that's why that is the first category being mentioned over here. However, says the Rebbe, we need to understand why Rashi then says Vahazav Ezoivoy in the next pasuk is one who saw twice and one who saw three times. And Rashi says Shetoiros, and that their laws were explicitly mentioned earlier. So what's the problem, says the Rebbe, from the diuk lashon of Rashi? Baal shtei re'iyos, Baal shtei shalosh re'iyos, one who saw twice and one who saw three times. Shetoiroson, that their laws were discussed earlier. It seems quite obvious that according to Rashi, the pasuk v'azav ezoivoi is describing two types of zav, one who saw twice, one who saw three times. So the question then is, this explanation that we said before, that we just explained, that Zois Toiras Hazav is speaking about someone who saw once, and V'Hazav Ezoiva is clearly going to be, in the next pasuk, is clearly going to be someone that's much more strict, more than someone that just saw Shichva Zera, and more than a regular Nida. So fine, that we understand. So there's the first category, one who saw once, and then there's the next category. But where are we getting from the simple meaning of the psukim over here that V'Hazav Ezoiva itself needs to also be two categories? In other words, that there's one who's a special category of one who saw twice, and another category of one who saw three times. Why is Rashi separating and differentiating now between these two themselves? Says the Rebbe, seemingly we could say that since Rashi had already told us earlier in the Parsha, at least as a medrash, that there are two categories of Zav, one who saw twice and one who saw three times, this is why he's specifying over here as well these two categories. But the problem with this is that the wording of Rashi doesn't seem so smooth then. Rashi says shetoirason mefureshas l'mayla, that their laws were explicitly said earlier, that their halachos and the differences between them were said earlier. But we said already, it doesn't say clearly earlier. Rashi said it as a medrash. Rashi should have said toirason nidreshes l'mayla. From the earlier psukim, we sort of derived it, we learned it out, as Rashi himself said earlier, that the difference between a zav that saw twice and saw three times is not the simple meaning of the psukim. Rashi said it's medrashay. Says the Rebbe, the explanation is, when Rashi said before the idea that this is medrashay, it's not like in some other places that you say medrashay, and the medrash is a different pshat than what would be according to pshuta, according to the simple meaning. In our case, says the Rebbe, according to medrashay, that is the pirush, that is the simple pshat of these psukim. In other words, the medrash is coming mainly adding a certain idea, telling us how it's hinted in the pasuk. But it's not the pshat that it's two different things. There's a medrash way of looking at the pasuk, and there's the pshat of the pasuk. And on the other hand, this drash is not something that is only going to help us further understand the pshat of the pasuk, but it's absolutely necessary according to pshutoi. Because it's only according to this drasha, or to use Rashi's expression sometimes, agodol liyashik pshuta shel mikra, we sometimes have a medrash that helps us understand the pasuk. It's only according to this drasha that we understand the long arichos in the pasuk, which according to pshuta is not understood. Why do you have all these extra words? As the Rebbe goes on to explain. Looking back at those psukim in the previous part of the parsha. So earlier on in the parsha, there was two psukim. First, there's two psukim. It says, Ishki ezav mepsara, if a person has a certain flow from his body, zoivoi, tamehu. So he has his flow and he's tameh. Then the pasuk says, v'zois tiyeh tumah, this will be his tumah, bezoivoi, when it flows, ror psara, zoivoi, if it's flowing, or it's plugging up or blocking his body because of this charge, to Masa he is tummy. Then in the following pasuk starts all the dinim of the tumah of zav, kol hamishkav, all everything that he lies down on, etc., etc., etc. So the Rebbe says in those psukim earlier on in the parsha, it's not understood. Why does the Torah interrupt between the words v'zois tiyeh to Masa bezoiv? This is the way he's going to be tamei, and the dinim of the tumah of kol hamishkav, all the bed that he lies in, etc. Why does the Torah interrupt that with the words ror b'saroi or hechtem b'saroi, which are not the dinim of how he becomes tamei or what the different kinds of tumah? Rather, it's two different ways of how the ziva happens. Whether it's a flow that's more in a clear liquid coming out, or hechtem b'saroi, it's coming out more thick and blocking the male organ. These words, Ror Psari Azoive, Hechtem Psari Mizoive, seemingly should have said in the earlier pasuk where it says, Ishki Zav Mipsari, if a person has this emission, or this discharge, Ror Psari Azoive, or Hechtem Psari Mizoive, the Torah should have given different options of how it comes out. Zoive Tamayu, then it'll be Tameh. And then you start with Zois Tia Tumaso, and this will be the dinim of the Tumah, Kol HaMishkav, etc., etc. This is why the Medrash comes along and answers and explains that we're actually speaking about two different things. We first have the pasuk describing one type of person and calls him Tameh, and then there's another pasuk that's describing another type of person and calling him Tameh. In other words, the Torah is coming to hint on two categories of Zav, which their Tumah is not the same to each other. And that's why they say in two different psukim. The pasuk is first, we have one pasuk that's describing one tumah of a zav, and then another pasuk describing another. And each one of them, individually, the pasuk calls tameh because they are different to each other. And these are the two categories of zav. What's the difference, and how do we see them in the pasuk? What are these two categories? That's what Rashi says. That each one of these times that it says zoiv that's mentioned in the pasuk is hinting to another re'iyah. Every time it says the word zoiv is hinting that he saw again and again. And therefore, in the first pasuk was speaking about someone that saw twice. In the second pasuk was speaking about someone who saw three times, because it says three times the word zav. So in other words, according to all of this, although we said it's a medrash that's telling us how it's hinted, but it's really pshuta shel mikra itself that's machriach, that's forcing us to say that we have to darshan something from all these extra words. And therefore, pshuta shel mikra is telling us there are two types of zav. There's one that saw twice, and there's one that saw three times. Since, as we just said, it's a medrash in our case that's forced based on Pshut Shel Mikra, so it's understood that the difference also in din between them, the fact that they have different dinim, which Rashi brings, that if one saw twice, then he's tamei, and if he saw three times, then he forces him he has to bring a carbon. So Rashi is not just quoting words of Chazal, which are opposite of the Pshat, but rather all of this is part of what's necessary from Pshut Shel Mikra. Why is that? Because since the words v'zois tiyeh tumasoi, this will be his tumah, is referring simply to the words tamehu, which says in the previous pasuk, by one who saw twice. So we have to say that the dinim of tumah that say in the continuation of the parsha are also going to apply by someone that saw twice. And therefore you have to say that what's the addition that happens when someone saw 3 times is not in the actual way of how he's tamei, the tamehu, but rather, if he saw twice, then he's tamei, and the 3rd time is going to make him bring a carbon. The Rebbe actually says the word over here is maskikosei lekarbon, doesn't say mechayvosei carbon. The word zika means, in other words, something that's necessary. In other words, there's another side, additional point that is now necessary that he has to bring a carbon. According to this, says the Rebbe, it's understood why Rashi at the end of the Seder says Bal shtei re'iyos u'bal shalosh re'iyos. And we said that Rashi says Shatayrosan Mufureshas Lamarla, that their dinim are explicitly stated above, because this difference between the 2 riyos and the 3 riyos is something that comes out of the pshutoi, out of the simple meaning of the psukim, as we just explained. And therefore, Rashi wants to explain which zav are we saying the Torah said already earlier, the laws of it, different to the Baal Re'iyah Achaz, the one that just saw once, which we said that the Torah just now at the end of the parsha is telling us what the halach is. But which zav did we speak about earlier on already? So these are the 2 categories of zav, those that saw both twice, or the ones that saw 3 times. The Rebbe says from the Inyanim Muflaim, from the amazing things, al derech ha'alacha, in the halacha way of this Rashi, is that the toicher of this Rashi at the end of the parsha is in Toiras Koyanim, found as well on the pasuk, both a number of differences, as the Mefarshei Rashi actually point out. However, says the Rebbe, there is a certain change in the lashon of the expression, which the Rebbe says, so far I did not find that anyone should actually discuss this. And the Rebbe says, Yesh Shloimar, that in this change that we're about to discuss, there's really a whole major inyan over here, and what we call a l'shitase, in other words, of the Toiras Koyanim halacha going in a particular shita, and Rashi going in his own shita, which goes according to Pshut Shel Mikra. And what is that? In Toiras Koyanim, the expression is, when we're discussing the people that saw different amounts of times, the Toiras Koyanim says, we have one person, Zesheror Iyachas, this is the one who saw 1 time, Zesheror Shteiri is the one who saw twice, the one who saw 3 times. Rashi changes. Rashi doesn't say Zesheror, this is the one who saw once, twice, or 3 times. Rashi says, Ba'al Re'iyachas, Ba'al Shteiri, Ba'al Sholosh Re'iyos. What is the difference? Says the Rebbe, we're going to understand this by first prefacing what we find in the Gemara 2 limudim on the difference that we said between someone who saw twice or someone that saw 3 times. How do we know this difference? The Gemara has 2 different ways of learning this. Number 1, we have the drasha of Rab Simoy, which Rashi actually brings, that the pasuk enumerates twice the word zav and calls it tamei. Then we have a pasuk that says 3 times the word zav and also calls it tamei. So what's the difference? Because we have 2 categories. We have one who saw twice, and that makes him tamei. And if you saw a 3rd time, so then you have to bring a carbon as well. So that's Rab Simoy's drasha. Then we have the drasha of the Chachamim. The Chachamim say as follows. It says Zoivoi, so that's once. Ror Besoroi, his body was dripping or leaking or running, so that's a 2nd time. Es Zoivoi is a 3rd time. And this teaches us, as the Torah says, say the Chachamim, that a Zav that saw 3 times is Chayiv a carbon. So that's one category. Then it goes on to say, the pasuk says, Oy hechtim psori mizoivoi tamei. If flesh was blocked from the ziva, then he's tamei. But the expression is mizoivoi, which the Chachamim say that means even part of being a Zav In other words, previously we said about 3 times. Now we have a pasuk that says mizoivoi. So that's teaching you that there's someone that even has less than 3 times, even if it's twice, he's also tamei. He also makes tamei that when he lies on, that's when he sits on, etc. What is the difference between these two limudim? So the Rebbe says the difference between these two limudim is actually in the geder of how we define and how we classify a zav that saw twice, which can really be learned and understood in 2 different ways. One way of understanding it is that a zav that saw twice and a zav that saw 3 times are 2 completely different categories. The tumah of one who saw twice is not the same tumah of the one who saw 3 times, and he saw 2 out of the 3 times, is automatically the same as someone that just saw twice. Rather, it's something completely for itself. In other words, seeing twice on its own, that makes a person have the tumah of a zav, and he has to count 7 clean days, etc., etc. So that's one way of learning it. There's a zav of seeing twice, and there's a different category of one who saw 3 times. Another way of learning it is that the tumah of one who saw twice is a part of the tumah of one who saw 3 times. And since it's a part of the one who saw 3 times, so therefore he only gets part of that tumah of the one who saw 3 times. The Rebbe says, based on this, we can actually explain what it says in Targum Yonason ben Uzziel on the pasuk Ish ki yezov, and the Targum Yonason says that this is referring to someone who saw 3 times. He doesn't even mention the concept of seeing twice, because the tumah of seeing twice is just a part of seeing 3 times. The tumah of a zav is 3 times. If you saw twice, well, that's part of it. Practically, says the Rebbe, what would be the nafka min halacha practically? The Rebbe says, b'derech efshar, in a possible way we could say, if there was an interruption, let's say a day in between, that the first 2 sightings and the 3rd one, do we say they're all going to combine together, and he's considered a person now of Baal Shalosh Re'iyos that saw 3 times, or not? In fact, this is actually a machloikas. According to Rabbi Eliezer ben Yehuda, this is a machloikas between Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel. If we should say that the tumah of someone that saw twice is a separate category of tumah, that means this person saw twice, he has a chiyuv, an obligation on its own to count now the 7 clean days, etc. And this has nothing to do, once he saw twice, it's not going to, now if there was an interruption, it's not going to be a person of 3 times, unless he sees immediately a 3rd time, then. So we now say that this 3rd, we now know that the twice was really part of a person that saw 3 times. So according to this, if there was an interruption after the 2 re'iyos of a day, so now clearly this person is not a person of 3 sightings. And what's being revealed now is that right after the 2nd time, he became a zav of 2 re'iyos. And when he will see after an interruption another time, it's a completely new thing, and it's not going to be mitzdaref, it's not going to combine to the previous 2. If, however, we say that the whole tumah of someone that sees twice is really just a part of it in the same category of the one who saw 3 times, so then what should come out is that even if there was an interruption of a day, of these, when he started counting the 7 clean days after seeing it twice, and then he sees another time, so then this 3rd time should combine to the previous 2. Because the counting of 7 clean days after seeing twice is not because the set 2 sightings by themselves obligate you, but rather they were originally part of the 3 sightings. Says the Rebbe, so now we can understand the difference between these 2 limudim that we said before, from where it's learned out. According to the drasha that we learn, the idea of a zav of 2 sightings, from the pasuk mi zoivoi, which we translated, which means that he saw part of a zav. In other words, the zav is 3 years, and he saw part of that, some of that. So that clearly is telling us that a zav that saw twice is part of, and within the same category, just a little bit less than a full zav of 3 sightings. Whereas, according to the drasha of Rab Simoy, that we said that we count the times that it says zav in the pasuk. We have one pasuk that says twice zav. We have a pasuk that says 3 times zav. That means the Torah is separately counting these 2 different types of zav and different psukim because they're 2 separate categories completely in the zav. Says the Rebbe said, now we could also explain the difference between the wording of the Torah's Koyanim and the Rashi at the end of our parsha. The Torah's Koyanim first brings this limud also, this idea of mi zoivoi, mikza zoivoi, that he's part of his zav. And therefore, the expression of the Torah's Koyanim, as we said before, is Zeh sherosh teiriyos, this is the one who saw twice, or the one who saw 3 times. In other words, the expression is emphasizing the ideas of what practically the person saw. In other words, generally it's all in the same category. But how many times did he see? Did he see twice? Did he see now a 3rd time as well? So it's only a difference in quantity. Practically, how many times did he see? But it's the same kind of person. It's generally within the same gather. Whereas the Rashi that's bringing the drasha of Rab Simoy, as we said, that there are 2 different categories. So Rashi is of the opinion that there are 2 different types of people. So we call one Baal Re'io Achas. He is a person that sees 1 time, or a person Baal Shtei Re'iyos, as Rashi says, a person that sees twice, or a person that sees 3 times. In other words, each one is really a category, a type of person completely for himself.